Mr. Lethal Weapon himself. Mr. Danny Glover, welcome to the Nina Turner Show on the Real News Network.
Well, I'm glad to be on.
So glad to have you here.
It's glad to be here, Nina. With all the hyperbole, I'm still glad to be here.
It's all true. When you got it, you got to embrace it. You do. And speaking of embrace, you've been doing this for a very long time. Why do you do what you do, especially in your position?
One of my positions has been constant ever since I took my first breath, and that's I'm a citizen.
Yeah.
And there are all the things that bring you to this point in life or where you are throughout life. It's not just didn't start yesterday, and it didn't start just when I decided I want to become an actor. It's the investment and having something articulated through movements, articulated through me, to me, through movements. My parents were postal employees, strong, staunch advocates of union, involved in their union, their local union, the National Alliance of Postal,
weren't they?
And they were involved in members of the NAACP, but they're members of the National Alliance of Postal Employees. And where you saw just at the point of the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Movement began to kind of find ground and find leverage. African Americans were dominating the postal service. I can go to Cincinnati. I can go to Rio Plata.
Where you going?
Yeah, I'm going.
Yeah.
I can go to Chicago, in Philadelphia, any place. And the first time I asked, raise your hand. See, and which one of your parents, grandparents, or uncles or aunts were at the post office, and the hands would fly up.
But those government jobs were really the entree for many African Americans into the middle class.
Absolutely. The entree, our parents became homeowners,
Yes.
when it was really affordable in San Francisco to become a homeowner. All those things, I think, were the things that were calculated in my life and were the foundation of how I began to see the world.
But what makes you do what you do? I mean, some people, is there a sacrifice? Are there risks that you take? You take hard stances on certain issues that may rub people the wrong way. Have you ever had to suffer a consequence within your career for being so outspoken for justice?
I don't think about that, because the career, the business itself is subjective in certain ways, that each actor, actress has their own journey, particular journey, and some of that has to do with what is considered the talent they have in New York, the Negro Theater Company in New York, all of those particular things. So I'm part of a legacy. That's the first thing you understand.
Yes.
You're part of a continuum. You're part of a continuum of ideas, of people who are using art as an expression of their own humanity and using that art not only for their own transformation, but the transformation of their community and society.
And to critique society,
exactly,
right? To
and to
voice
critique
to
society.
So, but speaking of your journey, though, in 2016, you decided to endorse the Democratic Socialist from Vermont, Senator Bernie Sanders. And I think you really talked about him as being the person that could really go up against a corrupt system that was really leaving working class and poor people behind.
I've been an active citizen ever since I saw my parents organize for justice. Today, I see a broken system that's not up to the task of fulfilling the promise of America. I've joined the Bernie Sanders campaign for economic and social justice because he's trustworthy, boldly courageous, and incorruptible.
What made you support him?
We have to deal with, I think, in a moment, and I'm not the first one to say this, the battle of ideas. What are the ideas? If we want to really fundamental change, what are the ideas that bring that about? Whose side are you on? It was like, whose side are you on, boy? Whose side are you on? And I felt that Bernie Sanders was on the side of working people. He was on the side of those who were less fortunate. He was on the side of those who were disenfranchised. He was on the side of them. And his messages, whether it was young or whether it was millennials or whether it's baby boomers like me or whatever, in between, everything in between was connected to that. And so I remember because I've heard about Bernie Sanders. I had met him before, but I had a great deal about him during Jesse Jackson's campaign.
One of very few whites elected officials to endorse him.
Endorsing all this. Say, well, look at here. And he tells the truth. He doesn't owe anyone anything.
Right. But he didn't. So the ideas, do his ideas still permeate? Because what are your thoughts about the current status of the Democratic Party and where that party should and could go into the future?
Well, I think on the one hand, so many people have pontificated on the current status of the Democratic Party.
Do we need a third party?
Yeah. I'm not so sure. I think that we may come to that point that we need a third party. I think it's possible at this period to use this Democratic Party, and if we determine that there's a third party, then certainly those constituencies, those citizens feeling that they no longer can be represented, or it's not a possibility to be represented, or we need another angle in which we to look at it, we need another voice within that, then I think that's important. But right now, I think we have to use what is developed in this moment. People came to the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders on there. So there's always been a left on the Democratic Party.
Right. You were in Philly.
Huh?
You were in Philly, and I just recently saw an interview that you and Paul J did. Had no idea. It really brought tears to my eyes, but I'm told that you were in the chair, you were about to interview with The Real News, and you get a call saying, Nina needs our help. We got to go. And you told Paul J, I got to go. My sister needs my help. And so you're in the car, and you and Paul J are interviewing, and you don't quite know what is going on, but you know that something is wrong.
Something's wrong, yeah.
We're going to a press conference, which is about Nina Turner. The Clinton camp doesn't seem to be all that concerned about unity or appeasing the Sanders camp.
Or even appeasing those who people are speaking on behalf of those people on the outside, the homeless people I see around here in Philadelphia itself, and all those who are in need of the Democratic Party, who relied on the Sanders campaign as a voice for them who were without a voice. So I think the point is that it's what Bernie's campaign has done, what the Sanders campaign has done, is expanded the body politics, expanded the involvement of young people, etc. For the Clintons, their idea of this whole thing and the Clinton campaign and everything else, their idea was get over it. You young people, get over it.
How was that moment? Not just about I'm with Nina, but I really believe that was a pulse of the people who felt forgotten during that convention process.
Well, that's what I think in some sense. And I think whether we're in Canton, Mississippi, or we're in Philadelphia, those people who were on the outside of the convention, I don't think Bernie Sanders and whatever compromises he made and had to make in order to make this thing flow he never was any inclusive in the process. He was always on the outside of this. And that's the problem with what has happened at that particular moment. And whether we can argue many points about whether this campaign of Bernie Sanders was either expected to go or was expected to have the kind of resonance that it did, or we can say, that it was forecasted. People out there, because they're upset. What they're going to do is they're going to find some sort of way in which to express that upset, the way in which they're upset about things. And they found that Bernie Sanders became, at that moment, the catalyst for them to express that. And you could see this, even possibly some of those people who voted for Trump were people who were potentially could have voted for Sanders at any point.
Well, we know that a lot of them did. I mean, so many folks that voted for President Obama both times ended up voting for Mr. Trump. Even in my home state, 70%, he won 70% of the vote in 30 counties in the great state of Ohio.
Wow.
So people are hurting. They're looking for something. As someone once said to me, they want genuineness, regardless of even if it might be hurtful.
And that's what he brought.
Right?
He brought to that. He brought that in his demeanor. He brought that in his message. He brought that in a way in which he was able to, through the campaign, hear the issues around mass incarceration. You know, he can hear the issues around Black Lives Matters. He can hear issues that he didn't just throw under the rug, you know, but it brought him to, he can hear the issues of LGBTQ. All of those things were on the table right now. And I think Bernie Sanders' presence there allowed for a dialogue that would not have been there
Without
you know, without him. Would
Well,
not
where
have
do
been
we
there.
go from here? I mean, we had the Women's March. We have a lot of people protesting in the streets. I believe protest is good, but we need somebody doing the planning. If
Well,
you were
this-
encouraging,
If I was here,
yeah, if you had to tell folks,
what
where
do we do? Where do
Yeah.
we? Because part of resistance is the idea of what you want, what you expect, how you envision. Dr. King talked about the dream.
Yeah.
When he talked about the dream, he was just not sitting laying in bed dreaming about it. He was talking about the dream
True that.
as a facilitating
Yeah.
the possibilities of who we can be.
Right.
And how can we transform ourselves? What are the ethical parameters of foundation in which we build a new world? You know, how do we look at climate change and everything else? How do we look at population? How do we look at war itself?
Right.
War and the ensuing refugee crisis. So we have these crises, but we have these opportunities to shape a world.
So you believe that there's promise in the problem?
I think, I don't know if it's promise in the problem, but I know there's promise in our addressing and understanding that we are the problem itself. We have to do what we have to do as citizens in order to have the possibility of changing the problem. Now, there's many obstacles. You know, we all know that 50% of the wealth in this world is controlled by who? Corporations.
Right.
Who make money off of war, who make money off of various other, the kind of instability that happens, the exploitation that happens with workers and people. There's money to be made off of that. There's profits that are being made. We're in a situation wherever we are, whether it's in this country or whether it's around the world, it's a race to the bottom. Now, why is that? Why haven't we been able, after all these extraordinary moments in the 20th century, we had historic moments in the 20th century,
Right.
from the labor rights movement, women's rights movement, all these things and everything. We'll keep pushing the envelope right now. Why have we not been able to overcome this next stage? Could it be that the system, the economic system it functions in some ways that we function in, is a system in which it, in a sense, entices us to remain engaged, entices us to believe that there are possibilities in it, when ultimately we know that the system itself is the main reason why we have the planet crisis that we're
It's
seeing.
rigged, right? I mean, it is rigged.
It's rigged, but rigged from the standpoint, but the things that happen around us, the things that we accept, all those things that we accept, all the ideas that we accept, and this is, I'm not trying to be esoteric and everything, but the ideas, what are the ideas around the world we want to build? You know, what does it look like? We talk about other places in the world,
Yes.
Hugo Chavez and
You just got back from Venezuela. How do you connect the struggle of the diaspora? You talk a lot about the diaspora.
Yes.
The connection between our black sisters and brothers in Venezuela or in Haiti, just the whole Pan-Africanism. You talk a lot about that, and that is actually lost. You just got back from Venezuela. How do you see that nexus, and can brown and black people all over the world come together in a strong way?
It's impossible that they can. I mean, they have to come together in a sense.
Do we know that, though?
And I think we do. I think and not to simplify anything, because there's no simple, uncomplicated situations that we be in. Realities are complicated in a way. So where do we define? And when I define the critical issue around the world through the main engine which dictates what happens in the world, the system of capitalism, is race. If we look at the issues around migration, immigration, if we look at the issues around destabilization, if we look at the issues that are created by those destabilization, We look at the bottom of his race.
But is there any way to deal? I mean, we live in a capitalistic society. It's not going to change in America. Is there any way, do you think, to make the system better for people? Because I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody who said, when I grow up, I want to be poor. I want to be on the system. But people treat poor people as if this is something that they envisioned for themselves.
And I think our first test is, where do we begin to elect progressives who are not bought off by the system, and begin to institute not only the policies that would change domestically the relationship that we have to capital, the relationship that we have to corporation. Where do we begin to elect them, in the sense, who are out there lobbying on our behalf, not on the system's behalf?
But you just hit the nail on the head.
You know,
and is that possible?
We have to believe it's possible, Nina. I mean, right now, in the midst of what's come, we have to raise the bar of our own expectations. You know, power tends to diminish our expectations of ourselves, our expectations, but we have to raise the bar on our expectations. And we have to be better citizens. We have to hold people accountable.
When you say better, do you mean informed?
Informed citizens and active citizens, not only elected, but we have to be able to say, I want to know who the dog catcher is. You understand what out there? They looked at a young mayor in Berkeley, California, 32-year-old Hispanic mayor. You know, we have to be. I'm going to do something Friday for mayor down in a congressional candidate in Los Angeles. So all those particular things that we have to see.
So if people are not running for office themselves, they need to find a candidate or a cause that they can believe in. We can't sit on the sidelines. I mean, if you could say to not just millennials, but anybody that has a consciousness who really feels as though the system is against them and that there is no hope, whether they don't like the fact that Mr. Trump is now president, or whether they believe that the Democrats rigged the primary, there are lots of people who feel as though that this thing is never going to be fixed. What would you say if you had to tell them 3 things that they could do, or 3 things to believe and to hope for as we move forward as a nation? What would those things be?
I mean, if I was to name one, I'd have to say, ask them to be involved in electoral politics.
But my vote doesn't count.
Huh?
My vote doesn't count, and I don't vote, Mr. Glover, because my vote doesn't count.
No. That's unacceptable.
Well, my life hasn't changed at all, and I've been voting for these people.
Our life may not change directly. What happens here, and what do we mean by life change? Does life change means that we have more Troyers or Tinkers to play with? Of life change means that we feel that I'm living in a better world. There has to be some place where you feel that you live around. There has to be a new sociology. You know, there has to be a new pedagogical approach to where we're going and what we're doing.
How do we get that? Not just with the people who should, you're right, expect more, but also the types of people that we will elect to office.
Well, we expect more out of them as well.
And do we not elect people? If somebody doesn't perform, then is it right to say, you know what, you don't get another chance. We're voting you out. We're not going to vote for you next time.
Well, I mean, that could be in some cases. Okay. I mean, those things can happen in some cases. You know, we have to understand that we're right now, that we could become, not the Trump card, but we could become
Please, not the Trump card.
We could become the most instrumental. I believe in this project of humanity. You know, and we watched it go a lot of ways, but you know, we have to believe in it, that we in ourselves, we right here are capable of not only imagining what our best interests could be, but also acting on that.
You believe we can make it happen?
I believe we can make it happen.
Okay. We're going to end on those possibilities, and we are so glad that we have you in that space. Thank you so much for joining me. You are the man. Yes, you are our lethal weapon for justice. Thanks so much for joining us for the Nina Turner Show on the Real News Network.
Hello, testing, testing. It's on. Can y'all hear me? Oh, really? I can't tell. Okay, first let me welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. This is a Real News event, and a little bit about the Real News. The Real News is the brainchild of Paul J. He started organizing it back in 2002. Eventually it grew, and it came here to Baltimore. We have correspondents all around the world. We broadcast on the internet, but we broadcast on a lot of platforms. We reach millions of viewers every month, and we try to do the news from the perspective of the interests of people on the ground. We decided to do this particular program because this is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And we think Dr. King was assassinated because of the positions that he took in his final year of life. And he did a speech April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, beyond Vietnam. Several weeks later, he did a speech at his church in Georgia, Ebenezer Baptist Church, on April 30th, that said, "Why I oppose the war in Vietnam." It is that speech that we're going to view tonight. So we have a 41-minute speech, and the Real News have managed to put video in it to present it so you can actually see a visual as he's talking about the issues that he's talking about. So after this, we're going to have some important people come up here and talk to you and interact with you in the end. So if you will, just join me in watching this particular film, and then we'll talk some more afterwards, okay? All right.
The sermon which I am preaching this morning, in a sense, is not the usual kind of sermon, but it is a sermon and an important subject nevertheless, because the issue that I will be discussing today is one of the most controversial issues confronting our nation. I'm using as a subject from which to preach why I am opposed to the war in Vietnam. Now let me make it clear in the beginning that I see this war as an unjust, evil, and futile war. And I preach to you today on the war in Vietnam because my conscience leaves me with no other choice. The time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. In international conflicts, the truth is hard to come by because most nations are deceived about themselves. Rationalizations and the incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataracts that blind us to our sins. But the day has passed for superficial patriotism. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. Freedom is still the bonus we receive for knowing the truth. Ye shall know the truth, says Jesus, and the truth shall set you free. Now, I've chosen to preach about the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is the most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for in all our history, there has never been such a monumental dissent during a war by the American people. Polls reveal that almost 15 million Americans explicitly oppose the war in Vietnam. Additional millions cannot bring themselves around to support it. And even those millions who do support the war half-hearted, confused and doubt-ridden. This reveals that millions have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Now, of course, one of the difficulties in speaking out today grows out of the fact that there are those who are seeking to equate dissent with disloyalty. It's a dark day in our nation when high-level authorities will seek to use every method to silence dissent. Something is happening and people are not going to be silenced. The truth must be told. And I say that those who are seeking to make it appear that anyone who opposes the war in Vietnam is a fool or a traitor or an enemy of our soldiers is a person who has taken a stand against the best in our tradition. Yes, we must stand and we must speak. over the past 2 years as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam. Many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. And so this morning I speak to you on this issue because I am determined to take the gospel seriously. And I come this morning to my pulpit to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This sermon is not addressed to Hanoi or to the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or to Russia. Nor is it an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Neither is it an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue, nor to overlook the role they must play in a successful resolution of the problem. This morning, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, but rather to my fellow Americans who bear the greatest responsibility in ending a conflict that has exacted a heavy price on both continents. Now, since I am a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, and new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries to people who are not poor. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population, we were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schoolroom. So we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village. But we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta. And I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. There's been a lot of applauding over the last few years. They've applauded our total movement. They've applauded me. America and most of its newspapers applauded me in Montgomery. And I stood before thousands of Negroes getting ready to riot when my home was bombed and said, we can't do it this way. They applauded us in the sit-in movement, and we nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. They praised us in Albany and Birmingham and Selma, Alabama. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise when I was saying, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor. When I was saying, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press. And as if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1964. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was not just something taking place, but it was a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for black and white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong or to Castro or to Mao as a faithful minister to Jesus Christ? Can I threaten them with death? Or must I not share with them my life? And finally, I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race, a nation, a creed, is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. And because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come today to speak for them. And as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand and respond in compassion, my mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak not now of the soldiers of each side, not of the military government in Saigon, but simply of the people who have been under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now. I think of them too because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution until some attempt is made to know these people and hear their broken cries. Now let me tell you the truth about it. They must see Americans as strange liberators. You realize that the Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1945 after a combined French and Japanese occupation. And incidentally, this was before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. And this is a little-known fact. And these people declared themselves independent in 1945. They quoted our Declaration of Independence in their document of freedom. And yet our government refused to recognize them. President Truman said they were not ready for independence. So we fell victim as a nation at that time of the same deadly arrogance that has poisoned the international situation for all of these years. France then set out to reconquer its former colony. And they fought 8 long, hard, brutal years trying to reconquer Vietnam. You know who helped France? It was the United States of America. It came to the point that we were meeting more than 80% of the war cost. And even when France started despairing of its reckless action, we did not. And in 1954, a conference was called at Geneva, and an agreement was reached because France had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu. But even after that, and even after the Geneva Accord, we did not stop. We must face the sad fact that our government sought, in a real sense, to sabotage the Geneva Accord. Well, after the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, the United States came and started supporting a man named D.M., who turned out to be one of the most ruthless dictators in the history of the world. He set out to silence all opposition. People were brutally murdered merely because they raised their voices against the brutal policies of Diem. And the peasants watched and cringed as Diem ruthlessly rooted out all opposition. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by United States influence, and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that Diem's methods had aroused. When Diem was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictatorship seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? It's a man by the name of General Key, who fought with the French against his own people, and who said on one occasion that the greatest hero of his life is Hitler. This is who we are supporting in Vietnam today. Oh, our government and the press generally won't tell us these things, but God told me to tell you this morning. The truth must be told. The only change came from America as we increased our true commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. And all the while the people read our leaflets and received regular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They move sadly and apathetically as we herd them off the land of their fathers into concentration camps where minimal social needs are rarely met. They know they must move or be destroyed by our bombs. So they go, primarily women and children and the aged. They watch as we poison their water, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas preparing to destroy the precious trees. They wander into the towns and see thousands of the children homeless, without clothes, running in packs on the streets like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers. We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. We have cooperated in the crushing of the nation's only non-communist revolutionary political force, the United Buddhist Church. This is a role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolutions impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that comes from the immense profits of overseas investment. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be changed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation. It will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes and with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Oh, my friends, if there is any one thing that we must see today, is that these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And they are saying unconsciously, as we say in one of our freedom songs, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And it is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. And this has driven many to feel that only Marxism has a revolutionary spirit. Therefore, communism is a judgment against our failure to make democracy real and follow through on the revolutions that we initiated. And our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo. We shall boldly challenge unjust mores and thereby speed up the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The rough places shall be made plain, and the crooked places straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. A genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts the neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing, unconditional love for all men. This oft misunderstood and misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the niches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of mankind. When I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of John. Let us love one another, for God is love, and every one that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. Let me say finally that I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against this war not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I'm disappointed with America. And there can be no great disappointment where there is no great love. I'm disappointed with our failure to deal positively and forthrightly with the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. We are presently moving down a dead-end road that can lead to national disaster. America has strayed to the far country of racism and militarism. The home that all too many Americans left was solidly structured idealistically. Its pillars were soundly grounded in the insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage. All men are made in the image of God. All men are brothers. All men are created equal. Every man is an heir to a legacy of dignity and worth. Every man has rights that are neither conferred by nor derived from the state. They are God-given. Out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. What a marvelous foundation for any home. What a glorious and healthy place to inhabit. But America strayed away, and this unnatural excursion has brought only confusion and bewilderment. It has left hearts aching with guilt and minds distorted with irrationality. It is time for all people of conscience to call upon America to come back home. Come home, America. Oh, my Khayyam is right, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. I call on Washington today. I call on every man and woman of goodwill all over America today. I call on the young men of America who must make a choice today to take a stand on this issue. Tomorrow may be too late. The book may close. And don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power, and I'll place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name. Be still and know that I'm God. Now, it isn't easy to stand up for truth and for justice. Sometimes it means being frustrated. When you tell the truth and take a stand, sometimes it means that you will walk the streets with a burdened heart. Sometimes it means losing a job. It means being abused and scorned. It may mean having a 7 or 8-year-old child asking your daddy, why do you have to go to jail so much? I've long since learned that to be a follower of Jesus Christ means taking up the cross. And my Bible tells me that Good Friday comes before Easter. Before the crown we wear, there is the cross that we must bear. Let us bear it. Bear it for truth. Bear it for justice. And bear it for peace. Let us go out this morning with that determination. And I have not lost faith. I'm not in despair. Because I know that there is a moral order. I haven't lost faith. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I can still sing, we shall overcome, because Carlyle was right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant was right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell was right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. And with this faith we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith we will be able to go out and transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith we will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. With this faith we will be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid, because the words of the Lord have spoken it. With this faith we will be able to speed up the day when all over the world we will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. With this faith, we'll sing it as we are getting ready to sing it now. Men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nations will not rise up against nations, neither shall they study war anymore. And I don't know about you, I ain't gonna study war no more.
Overcome, we shall overcome.
about 3 months after he made that speech, I guess I should look official, it's okay. About 3 months after he made that speech, there was a riot in Newark, New Jersey. I was in Germany at the time. I was a sergeant in the Army. I'd been in Germany for about 3 years. I decided after seeing that riot and seeing tanks in the streets of New Jersey, Newark, with machine guns pointed at black women and black children, I decided not to go to Vietnam, and I decided to come home. I came home. And to a great degree, I figured there was problems in America, but there were issues that we could take care of. So I started working with the NAACP. I started working with CORE, and we started integrating jobs and try to get white-collar jobs in the black community. I became a firefighter at Sparrows Point. I was actually helped integrate the fire department there. While I was working at Sparrows Point as a firefighter, they assassinated Martin Luther King. At that point, I felt something, but at the same time, I knew I had a responsibility. I was a fireman, so I had to report to duty. So I put on my gear, my helmet, my boots, the whole 9 yards, and I left home with the intention of reporting to the Sparrows Point Fire Department because a call had went out for everybody that was essential service to come to work. On my way to work, I was accosted by at least 6 different police operations. FBI, the state police, Park Police, the Baltimore City Police, the county police, etc. I mean, it was so many police, and I had my identification with me. I was in uniform, but I was a black man out on the street, and it didn't matter what I was doing or who I was. And it was that point right there after the assassination of Dr. King, that I decided that there was really serious problems here that perhaps we couldn't fix. And that eventually led me to investigate other options, and I ended up joining the Black Panther Party. And so in a way, I'm actually a child of that speech. I mean, and there's children throughout society that's been impacted by what Dr. King said and what Dr. King did and what he stood for. And to that degree, what I want to do is present to you at least one of the key people that was impacted by Dr. King, but also that was doing some organizing. And everybody knows Danny Glover, so I don't have to introduce him. I don't have to make it a strange introduction. But what people don't know, perhaps, is that in the late 60s, before we had any black studies, black histories, black student unions, Danny Glover and his comrades in San Francisco was the first people to organize a black student union, and it was the first black student union to strike and make demands that forced the schools, the universities to bring in black student unions, and it set the tone for student unions all across the country to create black student unions in their own particular school. So basically, he's one of the founders of of what we see today as a normal, natural thing. It started from him. It started right there. We know that he's been in hundreds of movies and television shows. We all love Lethal Weapon. Some of us might not like Mr. But what we don't know, or what a lot of people don't know, is that Danny Glover is actually a Nigerian African chief. And he doesn't make a big deal of it, but that's who he is when he goes into Nigeria. Also, and we see him going around the country, but he goes all over the world and he helps people, and people can stop him even as he's traveling somewhere else and say, Danny, I need some help. And he will stop. And one of the reasons I know this is because when I first met the man, I was waiting in a restaurant for several hours for him because someone caught him when he got off of the plane in DC. And they said, we're having this workers' strike. Nobody's paying any attention to us. We need you to help us, and we need some publicity. And Danny stopped what he was doing, and he actually joined them, brought attention to him, and it was 3 hours later when he joined us in the restaurant. And he didn't just keep me waiting. He kept Paul, he kept the CEO of The Real News here, he kept the ambassador to Venezuela, he kept some very important people. I thought I was, but he kept other people waiting, and we waited, and we were glad to see him and glad that he had stopped along the way to help. The other thing that people don't know about Danny Glover is that he is an ordained minister. He's a preacher, and he marries people, and he does that kind of stuff. And he keeps it kind of quiet. So in his heart, he's conscious. In his action, he's an activist. And in his speech, he's a teacher. And even in his films, he teaches us something about being a normal, actual human being. So I want you to join me in welcoming Danny Glover. Danny, please come up here.
Eddie Conway has a very extraordinary gift. He knows how to tell stories. When I was at San Francisco State from 1967, and we had what we call the Gator incident over 50 years ago, where a group of students went up to the San Francisco Gator student newspaper office, and we had a difference of opinion, and what ensued was a fight. A number of us, it was 9 of us, Landon Williams was one of them. Clarence Buzz Thomas was one of those. And several others were part of that. What happened, it drew a lot of attention because of that. Myself, so I was suspended from the university for 1 semester. We weren't on the quarter system for 1 semester. Some were suspended longer than that. But I remember, since the Black Student Union had an off-campus office on Ellis Street, I remember having to open up the office every morning. This is 1967, 1968. I was 21 years old. And I would first go and work in the Breakfast with Children programs that the Black Panther Party had started in San Francisco. And I would sit down with a brother named Sam Napier, and Sam Napier was in charge of distribution of the Black Panther Party newspaper. He would open the office, the Black Panther Party office, which is around the corner from the Black Student Union's office. And we would sit down, and I would listen to Sam pontificate. He was a bit older than me, like Eddie just did. So I thought about that, and Sam was just, and I said this at the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Black Party. He was a soldier in that sense. And when I've ever thought of myself in terms of that, I happen to be a soldier, a foot soldier in the process. And I say that most humbly in different ways, you know, because I look at the extraordinary, profound, prophetic voice of Dr. Martin Luther King, and what it means for all of us in our role as simple citizens to be foot soldiers. We may have a moment in our lives where we do something and in some ways translates beyond anything that any of us could imagine. Standing before you right at this moment is beyond anything I could have imagined at 21 years old. As a simple foot soldier, I struggled to read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth just as much as I struggled to read Kwame Nkrumah's The Question of the Congo, or Julius Nyerere's African Socialism. Trying to be a foot soldier, trying to understand more than I did the day before, trying to listen, trying to have my thoughts conform to the ideas of this extraordinary moments that we have, extraordinary possibilities that we have for change. As I look at Dr. King, as I've read this Beyond Vietnam speech so many different times. I've listened to it, I've heard parts of it, I heard it quoted in various forms and everything else, but I understand the essence of all that we searched for and all that we tried to understand. In some sense, he contextualized so much into this speech. He brings us to the truth and the reality that we live. In his voice about racism, extreme militarism, his connecting those to materialism, all those things are the things that we in some sense contextualize, but somewhere in his voice, his profound voice, he was able to take those and have us understand even more than we thought we were capable of understanding. And for King knew that he was not the movement, he was part of a much larger movement.
When Dr. King talked about the World House, he understood the relationship that what happens here, between what happens here and what happens in the rest of the world. But King comes from a long family of traditionalism, of internationalism. He's a history grounded in the voices of Paul Robeson, the voices of W.E.B. Du Bois, the voices of Eugene Debs, the voices of Emma Goldman. That's where King comes out of that contact. The voices of those profound and prophetic ministers and truth tellers before him. He comes out of that context as if he listened to every one of those voices, in which he absorbed every one of those voices that gave him an opportunity to contextualize not what's happening that at that particular point, that those voices flourished and were able to resonate in our public space, in our public life, but what it meant for today and this moment. So as we use this barometer, this space, this place, right here at that moment that we hear his voice now, we see the manifestation of that prophecy, the manifestation of his telling us that what we need to do as citizens, ordinary citizens, in service. In service. King always said you didn't take a PhD to serve. You know, it didn't take a great education to serve, but to serve humanity, to serve in that way. King brought us that, the sense of service, ultimately, the sense of an embodiment of ourselves and giving of ourselves, connecting service to love, love for humanity, connecting service to our compassions to build our possibilities of transformation. And that's what we're talking about. In every moment we see that. We see it in every generation. We see those things that happen in a moment that we now begin to think that we're on the path to something. But we know we have to continue to fight. We know that we have to continue to move forward. We know that we have to take the contradictions that exist today at this moment and understand that their historic significance, their past significance, and the relationships that are spun from those for today and the actions that we need to take. We know that. We know that more than ever. It's not as if we had, at the end of this, and we had no Trump in the White House, and we had some other manifestation of the Democratic Party. We would have had to deal with the same issues. We'd have to come to terms with the same reality, the same truth. You know, that what is it? Whose democracy is this? It's a major question that has happened in the history of this country. Whose democracy does this belong to? And whose voices are the ones that resonate and fight and struggle and dig their feet into the ground and say, we're going to stand here, we're not going anywhere. Those are our voices, the voices of service, the voices of those who've been dispossessed, the voices of those who've been disenfranchised. Those are what we're talking about here. And we know that they exist everywhere. We know that they're everywhere. I was down in Venezuela just a couple of weeks ago. The Venezuelan government signed a decree recognizing the decade of African descendants. Now, most of us, a lot of us haven't heard from the decade of African descendants. Even though that we know Essie Campbell, for us who know, a woman, an Afro-descendant woman in Costa Rica has just been elected this past Sunday as the vice president of Costa Rica. Even that we know that what we see in places like Costa Rica, and even what we saw would happen in Venezuela, Chucho Garcia, the head of the Afro-Venezuelan network, right there, and the work that was done. Even its president at the time, Hugo Chavez, who the first time he said, look at me, look at my hair. My grandmother was African. Thank you. They referred to him as a monkey. They referred to him in the most derogatory terms and everything else. As I went down there, as they celebrated or acknowledged the 164th year since the abolition of slavery in Venezuela, on that day, So they abolished slavery in 1854. Slavery was abolished here because of the Civil War in 1863. So if you look at that moment, the one thing that I took out of that is the moment we went to this Afro-descendant community in Barlovento. I had been there at least a half a dozen times on my more than 14 years that I've gone to visit Venezuela. And each way I was able to see the kind of transformation that was happening in people's lives as they took their own hands, used their own imagination to shape another world for them, to talk about their children and the future, to realize that they had health care, to realize that they had these institutions for education for their children, to realize that they weren't on the outside, on the hitters of Caracas, the capital. They were inserted and integrated into whatever was happening in that country, to watch this and witness it, and for them to celebrate it each moment, to celebrate the cocoa collective that they have, in which they make chocolate, some organic chocolate, some of the best chocolate in the world ever seen. To see all those and see the manifestation and the pride as they moved and exist in this. A few weeks earlier, I went to Brazil, and the country, just at the time that the sister Marielle Franco, just before she was assassinated, we were ever there in Brazil and talking to Lula, who understood the political dynamics that he was faced in. A coup had been achieved by the far right against the female president, Dilma Rousseff. And it had it had destabilized all of those organizations. They were thrown off balance. They thought that they had accomplished something. They thought that they had accomplished something when in 1985 they founded CUT. And then they found the Workers' Party. And they founded MST, the Landers Program. They thought they had accomplished something. And they had begun to integrate these ideas of equity, of justice for the Colombo people, for African descendants. Brazil is more than 50% self-defined African descendants. They thought that they had found something, and they were on to something. They were dismayed by what had happened and how all those elements that they had achieved had been criminalized in some way. The right wing had taken power, and what they were doing, they were partitioning and selling off the public space. Those things that are important today, they saw that. And you saw in their face, through the voices of Mario Franco and others, that you saw women leading, whether it's women from Bangladesh, women leading the charge for change there. And yet he was saying at the time, that if they charge me and come to bring me to jail, I don't want CUT to surround me. I'm going to jail. I'm going to jail like Martin Luther King went to jail. I'm going to jail like Nelson Mandela went to jail. Thank you. And we're going to have the people charge and build themselves and resist even more, to resist the injustice that happened, and recall in their memory that all that they worked for over those period of more than 30 years, all that they worked for was not for naught. All that they had worked for was here for them to not simply just walk away from, but to struggle and fight for. And fight for not what they had exist and what they had established, but something even greater. All those things are happening in the world. Dr. King realized in 1968 that this country was on the wrong side of the world revolution. We're still on the wrong side of what's happening. We're still on the wrong side of what's happening in terms of climate change. We're still on the wrong side of what's happening for men and women in the LGBTQ community. We're still on the wrong side. And it's our service and our responsibility through what we do, not only in domestic politics, but how we understand and our imprint in foreign policy as well. It's our responsibility to wage this fight and to keep on waging this fight for not only simply us, but for future generations.
for the transformation that King talked about. It was so clear, as if he spoke not 50 years ago, but yesterday about transformation. That's what he talked about. That is our responsibility. Those of us who are here and have been here and marched through those particular points in time over the last 50 years, it's our responsibility to train the new young voices here, right here in Baltimore, to train the new young voices everywhere here, to find ways of building coalitions, to understand that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, when we talk about the decade of African descendants, we're not just talking about black people, we're talking about humanity. And that's what King talked about, humanity. And what we need to do, our work. This is a very important moment for us right here. We know that. It's always easy to say, man, this is a critical moment. We got to do something. This moment, it's easy always to say that. But we know that it is now. Those of us, we have to do the work and continue to do the work. Those of us who know that we have to find new definitions and new relationships and building new kind of coalitions, we understand that. King knew about building coalitions. He could talk on the one hand to Bayard Rustin, you know, LGBTQ, or James Baldwin, and at the same talk to a socialist, Jack O'Dell. At the same time, he took all of this in. We have to build those coalitions. It is our responsibility. Those are the coalitions grounded in the love that he talked about. Those are the coalitions that are going to strengthen our resolve, that are going to have us push further and further and further, and have us reimagine what it means to be that simple question. What does it mean to be a human being? The first question in philosophy. And certainly the other question is, how do you know? Thank you.
That's going to be a hard act to follow. But the truth of the matter is, somewhere during the Democratic National Convention, I traveled to Philadelphia to participate in some of the activities around that. As I got into Philadelphia, I saw thousands and thousands of people with signs on them saying, "I'm Nina Turner." And I'm Nina Turner. I'm Nina Turner. And I'm like, who the devil is this? You know, I'm saying this was like news to me, right? So I went back and I looked and I seen that, well, okay, this was a sister that had took a position that Bernie Sanders had the right philosophy and the right direction in terms of doing something to help America move forward. So I said, okay. Several months later, I was in Chicago at the People's Summit, and I heard Nina Turner. I heard the fire, I heard the energy, I heard the insight, and I had to go over, I had to meet her and talk to her and so on. But the fact that in our history, and now I'm speaking about blacks, African Americans, et cetera, but actually America too, black women have led the struggle, have organized the struggle throughout our history, and we hear names like Harriet Tubman, and we don't necessarily give them the kind of the recognition that they need. We hear names like Fannie Lou Hamer. We hear names like Ella Baker. We hear names like Rosa Parks. Some names we don't hear, like Gloria Richardson, that was right here in Maryland, right? But in the vein of those sisters that took a stand, that did some organizing, that moved our struggle forward, I want you to join me in welcoming former state Ohio Senator Nina Turner.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Conway, for that wonderful introduction. A shout out to the sisters. The sisters know how to make it happen. And I'm talking about the sisters from the mosaic of humanity. You know, I often say on a Sunday morning, because I very much am in the same Christian tradition of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and oftentimes we forget to put Reverend there. But there is a moral connection to the ministry that he had here on this earth. But to the ladies in the room, if I was on a Women's Day morning service, I would say the following, that if God made any little thing better than a woman, he must have kept it to himself. Sisters, can I get an amen on that one? Kept it to himself. Wow, it is such an honor to be here with Mr. Conway and Mr. Lethal Weapon Danny Glover, Lethal Weapon for Good. And it's such a pleasure. I want to thank the Real News and, you know, with Paul's leadership and all the great work that they are doing. The speech that they showed for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King did not have video to it, and him and his team took the time to overlay that video. We need to give them for those images and the idea to put something like this together. So I think the most important part of this night will be our dialogue, but the fact that we have gathered together and that people are gathering together all over this country to recognize the sacrifices of not just Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but also of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And their children, their entire family sacrifice for this justice journey. And sometimes we just can't. I just want us to wrap our mind around that they gave so much to fight for justice in this country. Wrap our mind around that, because today in this country, for the most part, we can speak out against injustice without worrying about somebody coming to kill us, for the most part. For the most part. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to that family and to all of the freedom fighters whose names we know and those whose names we do not know. We owe them a debt that we will never, ever, 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 ever be able to repay. But sisters and brothers from all walks of life, we ought to put a down payment on the debt. We can't repay it, but we need to put 5 on it. We need to put 10 on it, 20 on it. We need to put some time, some treasure, and some talent on the debt. And that is all of us. Because what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was fighting for was for decency and dignity and liberation of the people who Zerl Neale Hurston said, whose skin has been kissed by the sun. And what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King understood is that African-American liberation, that black liberation was the liberation of humanity. And he did not equivocate on that. He was radical because he was fighting against the status quo of his day. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to read what Reverend Jesse Jackson wrote today in the New York Times, but I encourage you to read that because he told the absolute truth. And sometimes we don't want to deal with the truth. And the truth of the matter is that at the time that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lived, wrap your mind around this, a man that was a champion for justice and peace and love. When the Gallup poll polled his favorability, that he was in the 30s. I think it was about 36%. Wrap your mind around that. That is hard for us to understand in the 21st century, because as Reverend Jackson pointed out in his article today, that when the man was on the mission, and even Dr. King pointed it out in his speech when he made comparisons, that it was okay for them to be nonviolent against racists and segregationists in the South, but it's not okay to talk about what we were doing to our brown sisters and brothers across the seas. That was not all right. Even Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King alluded to that. So we do have some of the same problems on our hands 50 years later. And so to wrap our minds around the fact that he and other freedom fighters gave so much, they gave their lives, and those people who did not physically die gave their livelihood. And before he died, he was in Memphis to march with black sanitation workers who were treated worse than dogs, working their skin to the bone in a system that relegated them to only do that type of work. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was there with them along with other folks as they marched with signs, "I am a man. I am a woman. I am somebody. I am a human being. I am entitled to love and decency and dignity. I am." And so we need to begin to tell the truth about the history. That a lot of times, as Professor Eddie Glaude wrote about the whitewashing of the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., how people on the right use him and twist his words about judging people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, forgetting to put the emphasis on the fact that he was talking about how this country would not give African American folks an equal opportunity to live out their greatest greatness. That's what he was talking about. And how you got people on the left, these so-called Democrats, who will prop up the memory of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but then equivocate about whether or not we deserve Medicare for all or universal health care in the United States of America. We done with that. So we got to call out some folks. And in his speech, Dr. King made it clear that time has passed for superficial patriotism. Sisters and brothers, can I say, and the time has passed to be loyal to parties who are not loyal to our people. The time has passed. The time has passed. And the reason why somebody like Mr. Trump was able just to walk on up into the White House is because of the failing of one political party in particular. Not answering the cries of the people, being superficial about this thing. And folks just flat out said, you know, if it's a difference between the lesser of the two evils, we might just go with straight up evil. And that's what we have today. And so this is not about who is in the White House. This is not about the State of the Union. This is about the state of the streets. And that's what Reverend Dr. King was talking about. And half of these folks that stand up on MLK Day and these other days and talk and wax poetic about how great the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, if he was standing here today, they would be the very people against him because he went against the status quo. So the time has passed for superficial patriotism. The time has passed for us to just give away our votes and allow people to whisper sweet nothings in our ear and absolutely get nothing for it, generation after generation after generation. So the question becomes, what are we going to do? And how much more of this are we going to take?
Dr. King talked very clearly about revolution in that speech that we heard, a revolution of values. And he said the reason why he was against the Vietnam War is because he understood that the investments in that war from our tax dollars, for every dollar that we spent in that war, were less money that we would have to help the poor in this country. That is why he was against that war. And we have the same thing going on right now in the 21st century in terms of how much money we spend on the military compared to how much money we are willing to invest in our children. Something is wrong with that. We must call the moral question. The time is past for superficial patriotism. Dr. King went on to say that there's a time when silence is betrayal. So sisters and brothers, what are we going to do? Because Dr. King did what he needed to do. What are we going to do? What do we stand for? You know, Mr. Glover talked about how Dr. King said that we all can be great because we all can serve. I want to put a little Turnerism on that, if I may, sisters and brothers. I just came by to share word with you tonight. That I often say that titles are good. They get your phone calls returned. They get you in the room. Titles are really good. But purpose is better. And we need more purpose-driven people. That is what this moment is all about. And he laid it out for us in many speeches, but as Mr. Conway believes, as Paul was sharing with me, that this speech about Vietnam was the greatest speech. Dr. King was laying it out for us about what needs to be done and the sacrifices that we have to make as a people for the greater struggle of liberation. Or in the words of Brother Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. What are we willing to lay down? That we must not allow this moment to pass us by. This is our moment to seize. And sisters and brothers, again, this is not just, folks want us to fixate so much, overly so, on the man in the White House. And he makes it hard for us not to pay attention to what he's doing. I'm not saying ignore what he's doing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't bump up against and resist and fight what he's doing. But what are we going to do once we're done resisting? What are we going to replace him with in 2020? Because I say that any old blue just won't do. So while we are resisting, we must continue to persist. What are we going to fill that void with? Because the last time I checked, our sisters and brothers in Flint, Michigan have been without clean water for almost 4 years. Last time I checked. The last time I checked, racism and sexism and all of the isms that plague this nation were here before that man got into office, and unless we do something about it, they will be there after. The only difference is that now it's them bubble back up to the surface, making us come face to face with the fact that this is in the DNA of America. How many of you knew that the beloved President Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist watch list in this country up until 2008? President Nelson Mandela. We got to understand who we are dealing with, and that is what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was laying out for us. So when we leave here tonight, we got to renew our commitment. And we got to look ourselves in the mirror to ask the question, are we really doing enough to be the change? Are we actually doing our part to honor the life and the legacy of a man who laid it down for this country and this world and so many more of his contemporaries? What are we going to do for the cause? That is the question that we must ask ourselves. And then to get a deeper understanding of who the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King really, really was, and what he really stood for, and what he was really fighting for. Decency for all of humanity, starting with black folks. Decency and liberation for humanity. That is what we should be fighting for. So he laid out about how during the Vietnam War that we can send black boys and white boys to fight in a war against other brown people, but when they got back home in these United States of America, they couldn't sit down at a counter together. And some of that stuff is still going on. There were articles just this week how about black boys in particular who come from wealthy families. Right now in the 21st century, not the 20th century, the likelihood that they will still be poor. The fact that black men and women and other folks are still being gunned down by a justice system that does not see their humanity. My husband was a former, he's a retired police officer. Our son is in policing right now, so I get it from both sides. And wanting to make sure that my baby comes home safe every day. And that when he doesn't have his badge and his gun, he is another black man in America. But how is it that we can have a system that doesn't recognize the humanity of black folks? A very system that can walk Dylan Roof in yeah, take the brother to Burger King. But then people like Eric Garner, people like Alton Sterling. Now I'm going to tell you something. In America, when some of the first few words out of a law enforcement officer's mouth to a suspect, because being born black makes you suspect, the first few words out of that officer's mouth to that man was for him to put his hands on the car before he blew or shot him in the effing head. Now, if you don't believe me, go back and roll the tape. I got the receipts. So meanwhile, back at the ranch, while we talking about Stormy Daniels, we need to talk about the systems in this country, systemic racism, institutional racism in the United States of America, and not about some woman trying to make a buck or two. We got to get our priorities straight in this country. And we do have to realize that our law enforcement was socialized in the same country that we have been socialized in. That it is the system. It's not just about individuals. It is about the system. And that was what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about. That is what he was fighting against. But what he was fighting for was black, brown, white, yellow, and red folks to come together within the rainbow mosaic of humanity and to stand up, the poor people's movement. And for this country to invest in the poor people in this country. As the urban poet Tupac said, we got money for wars, but we can't feed the poor. Something is wrong with that. We got money for corporate welfare, but we look down our noses on our sisters and brothers that just need a hand up. That we're okay with bailing out Wall Street. Meanwhile, we leave Main Street to fend for itself. Something is wrong with that. Something is immoral about that. And guess what? These politicians will only get away with what we allow them to get away with. So the question becomes, what are we going to do for the cause? Man, I could keep going, but I'm going to stop right here. Because I'm feeling some type of way right now as I'm rolling the podium off the stage. I'm rolling the podium off the stage. But Mr. Glover said, don't stop. But I came to bring you word today that all is not lost. And I don't want you to get caught up on all that we see on TV and what we hear, because one thing that I know is that hope springs eternal. And as long as there is a God, there is a way. But he works through people, sisters and brothers, and those people are us. So I want to close, since Mr. Conway talked about, how phenomenal black women are. Pretty women wonder where my secret lies. Quote me a little Maya Angelou. No, I want to, and just women by extension, but let us not get caught up in that. When Dr. King talked about love and that love is fierce, he also talked about that every man, every woman deserves dignity. And those are even people that we don't agree with. But we can't get caught up in hating folks. The Reverend Dr. King said that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. And he said hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And it's not a conditional, I only love the people who agree with me. Because if we continue to relitigate 2016 in a way that tears people asunder, tears them down, or looks down at them, there's something wrong when people start punching down at folks. We got to find some understanding with one another, even if we do not agree. That is our call. So I want to end this portion of it with a quote from one of my sheroes, and I have many. One is my grandmother, but I'm going to save grandma for later. But I want to talk about Sister Harriet Tubman, and we know that she was a champion. She was a trailblazer. She put her life on the line, right, to free some other folks. I'm going to ask you what you're going to do for the cause. Who are you going to free? And you ain't got to put your life on the line to do it. Just some of your time, your treasure, and your talent, and let's get serious about being about our Father's business, the business of humanity. But when Sister Tubman said these words, and I want you to wrap your mind around this. She said, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If you hear folks hollering at you from the backgrounds, keep going. If you want freedom and liberty, keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. So my message to you tonight is that if you want liberty and justice for all, keep going. If you believe that we as citizens of these United States of America deserve to have a health care system that provides health care for all, keep going. If we believe that this criminal justice system should not be run or ran by for-profit prisons and treat black and brown folks differently from anybody else, we must. If we believe that the women of this country deserve their whole damn dollar, we must. If we believe that people deserve to live with dignity and understanding, we must. If we believe in a love that is fierce and that is strong and that can shake to the foundations hatred and bigotry, we must. And if we believe in the mosaic, the rainbow mosaic of humanity, we must never stop. God bless you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, we're gonna do this portion of the program, we're gonna do a Q&A. So I'm going to ask Senator Turner to come back up here and join me. Danny Glover, would y'all please come back up to the stage? You got, okay. Okay, you're gonna need this mic. Okay, when I was talking about sisters organizing, and I talked about Gloria Richardson. She was in Cambridge, Maryland back in the late 60s. Here in Baltimore City, we have a Gloria Richardson also, and that's Tawanda Jones. She's been fighting for her brother's justice, Tyrone West, for 4 years. Having missed the beat, having slowed down, her life's been threatened, her job's been threatened, and she continues to fight every week. West Wednesdays happen somewhere here in Baltimore. So, out of the honor of that struggle, I'm going to give her the opportunity to ask the first question. Tawanda.
Can y'all hear me? First of all, I want to give thanks and honor for just being here. And I'm most gracious for the words that you just blessed me with just now, and all I keep on hearing. So I really don't have a question. I just want to let you know I'm keep on going. I've been moving ever since they murdered my brother on July the 18th. For 245 weeks, 1,715 days, fighting nonstop for accountability. Nonstop. We just left West Wednesday, which was held at City Hall, and we took it to where the mayor and where the state's attorney and where all the jokes and the folks were. It was our obligation. It's our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We have nothing to lose but our chains. So I'm just going to keep on fighting, and I'm going to keep it moving. I'm never going to stop, and I feel like there is no justice. It's just us holding folks accountable. And just like Dr. King said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And right now, it's a worldwide thing, and it just needs to stop. So I'm never going to stop until killer cops are in cell blocks. I respect officers like your son, like you worry about your child coming home to you. A good officer. That's why I call out killer cops. I don't put them all in one box because they're not. But at the same time, we see a bunch of snakes coming down the street. I'm not going to stand there and watch and figure out who's poisonous and which one's not. I'm going to keep it moving. So thank y'all. We more than hashtags and body bags. We more than being 6 feet in the dirt and pictures and buttons on T-shirt. Our lives matter. Thank you so much.
Okay, so is there any questions in the audience for Danny, for Senator Turner?
Yeah, I have the mic.
Oh, okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. I'm Nikichi Taifa. And I'm sorry, Brother Eddie, I got here late and didn't hear part of your presentation. But first of all, thank you, everyone. You know, I felt like I was in church. I mean, just really fired up. But you know, Eddie, you were a victim of the COINTELPRO, the FBI's one secret legal campaign to destroy the movement. Martin Luther King was a victim of the COINTELPRO. If COINTELPRO had been in Brazil, Muriel Franco would have been a victim of the COINTELPRO. So guys, my question is, in today's BIE, Black Identity Extremists, the new label that the FBI has put on our leaders, just what is it that we can do to ensure that what happened in the past is not repeated today, and that folk today know, in fact, what happened in the past, which caused people like you to serve over, 40 years unjustly, in prison. So that's my question. So the COINTELPRO, illegal abuses by government against people who are talking about everything Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about and more.
Yeah, and all I would say is that we have to organize, and educate. There's already been people locked up that hadn't broken any laws, but had been identified as black identity extremists. In Texas already, there's people facing 10 years for that, for having a mindset. And that's an immediate threat to organizers and activists throughout the black community, but the National Defense Authorization Act is an immediate threat to every citizen in the United States of America because it gives the president or his designee the power to lock up anybody, anytime that they declare that this person is an enemy of the state. That's what that whole terrorist campaign that started after 2001 has led to now. The COINTELPRO of yesterday that was illegal is now legal today for not only blacks, but everybody in this audience right now. And so you gotta organize and build. Is there another question? Go ahead.
Peace and blessings. I'm Taliba Yvette Macon. What I really want to ask is a ground level question. I love my people, I love my community, but we seem to be killing as many of each other as everybody else. What do we need to do or to stop it? Okay, like, if there are gang members and there are children, what do we do to go get them? Or some of them. Everybody's not gonna come, but they're our future and they matter. They matter greatly to me. And we talk about police killing us, but when I'm walking down the street and I love brothers and I see somebody's children coming and I feel fear, something is wrong with that. So beyond the world, right in our world, in this community, we need to save our people, our children, our brothers, their mothers. And I've even worked on programs that were just programs because they really didn't meet the need of the family. When I talk to people, everybody says, I'm gonna help the youth, I'm gonna help the children, but aren't we all the children of God? So if you don't start with their families, then you're really not helping the youth because we need strong families in Baltimore. That's how I'm feeling today.
You know, as I listened to the question, I also thought about the extraordinary opportunities that happen in communities every day. Places like Detroit, places like Minneapolis, places like Chicago, where young men and young women are recalibrating what is happening in their communities, whether it's through the activities of urban gardening, whether it's through the activities of organizations that are peace zones within the community. All those things of the emerging of, I think, a new dialogue and a new narrative that happened in our community. How we nurture those things is very important. Certainly, and we don't know what the outcome is. You know, I think at the same time that you justifiably are right in the fear that you have just expressed. We all do that. But we have to find ways in which I think we find those avenues in which we can intersect, engage,
And as Eddie keeps saying, organize and organize. And when we see this happening, we know that it is women who are in the leadership, and acknowledge that as well.
One of the things that I do, sister, and I've been doing this now for about 3 years, is that every morning I go to the corner store to get me some coffee. Now, it's really not about that cup of coffee, but that's where the youngins are hanging at, right? And so I first start going down there and I speak love into them, and I speak peace. How y'all doing today? You know, what y'all got up for today? Is everything all right? How you feel? And then at some point they begin to trust me. And then I start talking about things that matter to them. Well, you know, I just heard that you could get your record expended. Oh, I can. Where can I do it? I'm going to bring you some information tomorrow. You meet me up here at the same time. And I start speaking love and information to them. And now they call me Ma, and they listen to me. And then I bring up things that I read about that's going on in the community, and I ask them, now how would you deal with that? Would you know, we can't all take out our pistol, even though we feel like it, you know, but we can't do that. How we gonna handle this? And then I tell them the things that as wisdom that I gathered as being my 60-some years old, when I didn't have wisdom because I grew up in the street. So bottom line is, I was afraid at first. I'm not gonna lie to you. But God told me to get up in the morning because they be down there at 7 or 7:30 and stay down there until like you going to get your cup of coffee and speak love and speak safety over to these youngsters. And that's the way I do it. And now I don't have no fear. I don't have no fear. And I watch them and I tell them stuff like, man, you know, you done grown since last summer. I'm watching. I say, you must have grown about 5 inches. And they know I'm showing love to them. So we can't fear our children. I understand what you're saying, but you have to just take God with you, and you have to say one-on-one. Talk to one. Then he said, what's she talking to that lady about? And then he'll come listen because he want to know. Then another one will come listen because they want to know. Next thing you know, they can't wait till I get down there in the morning to open the door for me. That's Mom. So that's the way you do it.
Baltimore that wants to run independently, because so many of us, me included, are unhappy with the Democratic Party. It's become a corporate party, and you don't know where Republicans end and Democrats begin, but and you talking about collusion. I think when you have superdelegates, that's collusion, and they're not getting proper representation. So I ask this to anybody on the panel: how can we ease the two-party system, and how can we get rid of superdelegates within the Democrat Party?
Well, thank you so much for that question. First of all, there was a Unity Reform Commission that was formed from the 2016 campaign, an agreement between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton's 2 campaigns. We met for almost a year. I was on that Unity Reform Commission, and certainly the Bernie 8, as we're called, because there were 8 of us that were appointed by Senator Sanders. We were nowhere near the majority. We were outnumbered, but we did come to some consensus. Now, written within that resolution was the automatic reduction of superdelegates by about 60%, even though the Bernie 8 wanted all of the superdelegates gone, just all of them, because it is unfair to have superdelegates put their bodies and thumbs on the scale before the nominee is even. That happened in 2016. And it don't matter who you were for. Fairness is fairness, and it is an unfair system, and I'm here to tell you that the system is rigged. It is real. Not just that system, but the system is rigged. But one of the things that can be done, the Democratic Party has, well, when they have their summer meeting, they're going to be taking up the recommendations of the Unity Reform Commission. And people who care about whether or not this party transforms itself should get engaged. And so I want to invite you to go to ourrevolution.com. You can read the Unity Reform Commission's report, and hopefully we can get them to do away with all of the superdelegates, every single one of them moving forward. But you have an opportunity, send an email or call Chairman Perez and make it known what kind of party that you want to see. In terms of the two-party system, they're corporations. I want folks to know these are private entities. I hope we understand this. They get to make the rules that all of us have to play by. So it is hard in this country. In other countries, they have more than two parties, but in this country, we have two parties. So we have a decision to make. There will be some of us who will work within that party to try to change it, and there are going to be some folks who are going to work outside to bring the pressure on the inside. We need both of those things. But if progressive-minded folks, and that doesn't mean that we always have to agree, but progressive-minded folks who want to work to not just transform that party, but to take over that party. So when folks say to me, somebody like me, if you don't like it, leave, I'm not leaving, you leave. You leave. You know, that's no different than some, racist folks telling black folks to leave the country. You know, and to have some Democrats who are the corporatist Democrats say to progressive Democrats, leave the party, is a slap in the face. Now, we gotta either straighten out this party, and if it can't be straightened out, then we gotta take some other course of action. But what we're not gonna do is continue business as usual. So please, sisters and brothers, write Chairman Perez, look up and find out who is your representative on the DNC, because we will be voting in the fall, summer to fall, about whether or not those superdelegates should still exist. If you put some pressure on them, that kind of pressure that Reverend Martin Luther King was talking about, put the pressure on them, then we will see the change. And if they're unwilling to change or move, then maybe we need to change and move.
Okay, got time for one last question.
They talked about capitalism as a system, a vicious system. Leadership in this country, black leadership doesn't speak to that issue. And everything that's vicious in terms of poverty, criminalization, black folks being messed over, and people of color, it's capitalism. Let's be clear about that. So when you talk about a third party, that third party has to represent something different. And if you're not representing something different, you can't buy into the same old stuff. The Democratic Party has been there. You talked about it yourself. And Donnie, I totally appreciate your work, your body of work. But African people all over the world are suffering, and people of color, because of capitalism. That's what Vietnam was about. King couldn't say it in 67, 68, because he would have been called a communist or a socialist. But it was clear what he was saying. So how do you address that? Because I don't hear it being addressed at this particular group, because our leadership has to be clear about where we're going, how to get there, and creating something different. Even in Baltimore, we had a black political party called UJIMA that ran in the 7th district. It was not successful, but it was a beginning, on a local level. So we need to do something about that. Bernie Sanders himself declared himself a Democrat, even though throughout the whole process, when he was asked, what am I? I'm a Democrat. That doesn't work. Anyway, that's part of my question to you, as well as a semi-statement.
Well, I don't want to monopolize all this. I mean, people can define and declare themselves. You're addressing it. So all of us can't address the same things. It's the differences that make the whole. The senator said he was a democratic socialist. In other words, we know what pure communism is that, the government controls the flow of all goods and services. We're going to never be that in this country, because that's not who we are. But your point about understanding how this system itself suffocates folks, and what are we going to do collectively to address it? That means that we have to have people like you who speak up and speak out about it, and you can't be the only ones doing it. And we also are going to have to take the risk to say that if the system does not change, that we're going to change and that we're going to move. But we can't expect, this is not just about who the elected leaders are, this is about who we are. Because they only going to do what we allow them to do. And so I want to give one good example about what just happened recently with the bill that just passed the Senate to lessen the regulations on big banks, because this is something, I think this is a good example of what now this just happened just happened. I ain't talking about 10 years ago. I'm not talking about 2 years ago. I'm talking about almost 2 weeks ago. And you had 14 Democratic senators who voted for a bill to allow big banks to take even more risks, those same risks that almost took us under in 2008 when we had to bail them out. And also written in this bill is their ability to red line in black and brown communities. 14 Democrats gave them that vote. So to your point, and then those very banks that benefited from that bill turned around and wrote Republicans and Democrats a thank you letter for the giveaway. And one of those senators was Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. Now, the reason why I bring him up in particular is because the last time I heard that 98% of black women, 93% of black men put him over the top in Alabama, and he didn't hesitate to vote for a bill that he knew would harm black communities, poor communities. And why was he able to do that? Because he has no fear that the black community in particular, not exclusively, because over 90% of us sight unseen, sisters and brothers. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Sight unseen. They don't have to do anything for us. They know, they can predict that the black community is the only community that votes without making a demand of the Democratic Party. They can guarantee that over 90% of our vote will go to them, and there is no consequence to that. So to our brother's point, everybody has to take up the mantle that matters to them. For some, it's the environment. For some, it's income and wealth inequality. For some, it's talking about the harm of a capitalist system that does not have humanity in it. And some people will argue that there will never be humanity in capitalism. I'm not necessarily going to go that far, but some of us need to take up our crosses and our mantles, and we make the whole, and all of us will cover the whole thing. But we have to make a demand of these folks and stop letting them fear-monger us to vote for them because the next person is going to be worse. You know, I had one of my mentors, her name was Councilwoman Fannie M. Lewis, and she used to always say this: it doesn't matter if you meant to kill me on accident or on purpose, dead is dead. And that is our message to the Democratic Party. And so we got to demand more as a people. Every other ethnic group don't just give their votes away like we do, but we do. And what do we get for it generationally? I'm not talking about individual positions. Do you know in the history of this country, there's never been an African-American woman elected to serve as governor in the United States of America, yet we just give away our votes? And what about our white allies? Because we can't do this by ourselves. What about our brown, red, and yellow allies? If people of good consciousness, regardless of their ethnicity, unite, there is nothing that we cannot do. And so all of us are obligated to call out injustices. There's only been 5 black men elected in the history of this country. We got Ben Jealous running right now in Maryland. So the question becomes, what are we going to do to hold elected officials accountable when they are not doing right by the people? And then don't even get me started on our Native American sisters and brothers who are just, we don't even talk about them. So we, the collective we have to change this system, and we can't be afraid to do it. And that really was what Dr. King's message was to that particular speech. The question becomes, what are we going to put on the line? And what demands are we going to make? And when are we going to call out people when they are wrong? This is not about political affiliation. This is about your affiliation to humanity. And people want to ask me, are you a Democrat? I'm a hell-raising humanitarian. That's what I am.
I mean, as we take this moment 50 years ago, and we translate this moment to where the country was 50 years ago, and many things that Eddie and I remember, whether it was students in 1968 in Paris were out on strike, students in
at Columbia University out on strike. Students in San Francisco State were out on strikes. We had the massacre of students in Mexico City during the Olympics. Let's understand that clearly that period of time represented a period of time where there was a vicious effort to erase a generation of thinkers who had other ideas about the possibility of what kind of system we can build. The issue around systems of what are the relationships. Julius Nyerere in African socialism talked about the systems of relationships, those systems of relationships of cooperation as opposed to systems of relationship of competition. And that all the human activity in human development have gone further by the relationship that is born out of cooperation. And I think we understand that clearly. We understand that as part of our internal orientation the moment we come in. It becomes cooperation in that sense. From that sense, for the day that we've come on this planet, it takes cooperation to get you to walk and talk. It takes cooperation to have you grow from childhood, to adolescence, to adulthood. It takes cooperation. What are the system of cooperation that we're going to develop beyond humanity, or across humanity, rather? And I think the question becomes whether it looks something like we don't believe in, something that we've been told not to believe in, whether it's socialism, communism. The AMA, at the time that Medicare was passed, faulted the whole part of the first 20th century. Why? Because it looked like socialism. It looked like communism. Understand the terminology. All the reasons why this country does not have a universal health care plan like every other modern country in the planet is because it looks like communism or it looks like socialism. Let's throw away the terms and talk about what are the relationships that have evolved. And those relationships that have evolved have come, that we exist in now, it's come from, as Dr. James Lawson said, Reverend James Lawson said just the other day, plantation capitalism. Understand that term, plantation capitalism. What do we see now? The wealth, the prosperity, everything that's happening. King realized that. He realized it was based upon plantation capitalism that marginalized, that disenfranchised those people who were valuable in building the wealth of this country, but also marginalized poor whites as well. Understand that. And if whatever systems that arrive out of it, just like the system of capitalism came out of various forces, various political forces, various forces in terms of the evolution of technology and the relationship that man has with nature, came out of that. What are the systems in our new configuration of who we need to be and what we need to do in being the human beings? What are the systems that we evolve? We may want to call it something else. It may evolve into something else. It may emerge into something else. But unless we understand that and have the vision and imagination to force for that, we'll sit here discussing whether it's communism or capitalism or the virtues of capitalism or the virtues of socialism and everything. What is that system? And how does that system, in its dynamics, in its own internal contradictions, force us, push us to grow and evolve and change and continuing and understanding those dialectics are changing generationally. Those dialectics are always changing. Those contradictions are always changing. They're never the same. But we have to make a commitment to that transformation where it's perpetual, sustainable activism that will create the systems that we need, the systems that we will embrace as human beings and elevate our humanity and build what this young preacher was talking about. He's young, 39 years old. This young preacher was talking about building that beloved community. What does that beloved community look like? How does it feel? How does it talk about how we share? How does it talk about how we live in the city? James Lee Boggs, married to Grace Boggs, said, we're going to be an organizer out of Alabama, auto workers, radical organizers out of there, talking about we're going to live in cities. If we're going to live in cities, as we recognize over the 20th century that the majority of human beings live in cities, what does those cities look like? What are the relationships? How do we now take those relationships, those past relationships, have just alienated us from the land, have alienated us from each other? How do we take those systems now? Those systems, new systems that we evolve into, we grow into, we fight for, and we say, keep going for, keep going for. How do we take those systems that make us and transform our humanity and relationship to each other, relationship to ourselves, relationship to the rest of the planet, even the Mother Earth? Those are the systems. When the Native people, First Nation people, talked about what does this earth look like 7 generations from now, they weren't talking about communism or socialism. All they knew that there was a relationship that they had with the land. When Native people in the 11th century, Native people in the 11th century called a conference in the Americas, right here in 11th century, long before Columbus, and talked about what are the relationships are we going to have between us? What are the tribal relationships? How are we going to protect and nurture the young? I mean, there were conflicts within that context. Yes, there were conflicts, but they were finding ways of resolving those conflicts. It was based upon cooperation with each other, cooperation with this incredible, fragile, beautiful planet that we live on, but it moved towards something higher and keep reaching for something higher. So those are the ideas that we have to say. These are the ideas that King left us with. This is what he left us with. This incredible possibility, the possibility, not the dream, the possibility of who we can be. That's what it is, the possibility of what we can do. He was very clear about who we are and what we can do, but he knew that we can go further than that as human beings. And that's where we're at right now. And we have to take all of this, take every single, everything that my sister here has talked about, whether it's universal health care, whether it's the rights of women and the struggle for women, whether it's the idea of being full citizens in a democracy, in a participatory democracy, not a democracy that is governed by simply who we elected, but we hold the politicians accountable, and we down there, and we everyday activism, every day fighting for that voice, our voice and everything. What does it take to create that and assemble that? And who knows what may happen if we do that? Who may know what would happen? Every one of us could be in jail because we try to do that. Because we know what is happening to the sake of participatory democracies in other places in the world where people really become active, really become citizens, and understand the role that they play as ordinary people, ordinary citizens. Where do we take that on? And where it becomes sustainable? What is, in Grace Lee Boggs' last book, the next revolution is evolution.
Okay, that was the last word from the panel, but we have a word from the Real News. Tracy? Or they're going to play the promo. The promo is going to be played first. Okay, we can get off the stage.
We're not just doing the news because we want to understand. We're doing it because we want to make a difference. We want to make real change.
If you ran Maryland and Baltimore in the interests of the majority of its people, what policies would you create?
want white children in their neighborhoods. They got skateboard rings, playgrounds. Our children got the concrete jungle.
We are so just let down by the hypocrisy in the politics.
Our plan is to develop news, analysis, and cultural programming that will break through to a Baltimore audience.
We produce a roundtable show called The Real Baltimore to delve into issues like housing, education, poverty, and policing.
We're covering everything from toxic waste dumps in Baltimore to global rising temperatures.
Does treating prisoners like animals actually make our community safer? That's what we're trying to find out in Rattling the Bars.
The Whole Bushel is an artist interview show where we sit down with performing artists.
I'm your host, Easy Jackson.
We will deepen our investigative work and debate solutions in town halls held in our downtown studios.
We know that this is an ambitious plan, but the times cry out for it. So please help us make real news. Ladies and gentlemen, can anybody hear me? Is this on? Am I on? It's like 5 mics. Hello? No mic? Hello? Oh, here we go. We got one mic on. Okay, really quickly, I know you're all trying to leave out of here. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. Really appreciate all of you being here. And of course, we appreciate our special guest this evening, Mr. Danny Glover, Senator Nina Turner, Eddie Conway. They deserve a huge round of applause. I also want you guys to take a moment and please thank the Real News Network team, as well as the Ida B's Table team. Without those folks, none of this could happen. They really pulled this off. And that's part of the reason why we're able to exist. We're able to actually produce free events like this because of people like you, because you donate to the Real News. You all received an envelope when you first came in that allows you to stick a little change inside. You can also text to donate as well. There's a Rouge who's standing over in the corner at the Real News Network table. She can take donations as well. And I believe that some of you are here to go to the reception later on, heading down to Ida B's Table. Anybody? Somebody? Yeah, everybody? Okay. So Ida B's Table is directly downstairs. You want to go outside to the left, and they'll have the doors open. We're going to have a little bit of food for you to taste. We have a cash bar. Basically, it's just time for you to have a good time. So thanks again for coming out, and we appreciate you.
Let me just add something else, because I came by this space more than 5 years ago. This is your space. This is your space. This is space. The vision of all those who brought with this Paul J. or Shaman Perez, the vision that they brought to this, and all the young people who work here, who come a part of this, was a vision to be inclusive, to bring you here. This doesn't just happen because all of a sudden someone gets up in the morning and says, we're going to make this happen. It takes hard energy. It takes resources. It takes resources. You have to embrace this, engage this, and hold it tight, because it is your space. This is allowed to happen here in this space, this community space, right here, because the need for it, the passion for it. You're here because of the passion for the words that you need, the words that push you forward day after day after day. The conversations that go on here are the conversations that surround your mind and everything else. So we need you to be the stewards of it. We need you to take responsibility for it. It can't be just wishing somebody else can do it. You have to do it. You have to be engaged and continue to be engaged. And you can't imagine what it takes for them to put on this like this, for the Real News to be constant day in and day out, 24 hours a day, on top of all the major important subjects and topics that we do. And how little it could be of your resources, the moments that you can share what we need here to keep this going. It is only going to happen if you're going to do it. It's only going to stay alive if you're going to do it. It's not going to be some rich capitalist who's going to come and say, let's make the Real News work. Because this is the antithesis of who they are. This is the antithesis of who they are. So it's on you. We're modest. We don't ask for a lot, but we bring you here thinking that you will absorb this, take this in, and take it with you, and understand our responsibility. Understand that we have to go on. Keep going. And the only way we're going to keep going is with you. Thank you.